So it is the February meeting and it's almost the end of February. We're soon into March and that means some thawing out, some more summer birds. I can't wait for the warblers, but winter wren would sound awfully good about now too. So looking forward to the next phase of birding. But before we get there, we have a lot to talk about with winter finches, and that's why Tyler is here today. We've talked about the red wings. So this is the map of red wings from, I think it's probably all time. I think there's probably two. There were the red wings that we've seen were the 4th to the 8th records, I believe. So we had prior to this one that was already in the Halifax County, and we are seeing a number of them along the coast in Nova Scotia. And I'm actually kind of surprised, I don't know if you guys are, but that we haven't seen, because we've seen so many red wings, that we haven't seen more thrushes. But maybe it is just as Tyler said earlier, that there's a flock of red wings in the air and they got taken off or took off for some reason. You wonder how many of them didn't make it over the Atlantic trip. I wanted just to briefly mention that we are getting reports of sick birds in the province. Trichomoniasis and other diseases we'll come up to in a second. We're not absolutely sure it's trich. We're just trying to figure that out now. The Canadian Wildlife Health Cooperative is collecting specimens. They have confirmed trich in New Brunswick, and we have a few cases that look like trich in the province. And we're getting reports from Digby to Cape Breton. I wanted to bring it up today just to make sure that all of us members were supporting all the people that we know who feed birds, to make sure that they understand that if they see a sick bird, they should take their feeders down, make sure the feeders are cleaned. And a lot of people seem to think that cleaning we should prevent trich, but it actually doesn't. It might reduce the risk, but it certainly doesn't eliminate the risk. It's the socialization, regurgitation, and spreading the parasite because of that socialization and feeding together. So it's important that people get supported, that they don't feel badly that they didn't clean their feeders well enough. That might or might not make the difference here. What's going to make the difference is to take feeders down when we have sick birds. We're also seeing mycoplasmosis, which is a disease of the eye. So I personally have seen a couple photos of evening grosbeaks that looks very much like they have mycoplasmosis as well. So this is just in the last week to 10 days that we're seeing these small numbers, but still concerning to us. So again, if you can check your own feeders, check birds, and support people that you know if they have problems. We'd like to get these, if you have a sick bird or know somebody who does, we'd like to get those reported to the Canadian Wildlife Health Cooperative. Also, the winter 2019-20 plus the spring 2020 birding magazines are out today. They have been on the website for some time, and I'm sure people have gone and looked at them. They are remarkably beautiful. I've seen a couple paper color copies of them, and they're gorgeous in color, which of course you can view online. But the content is spectacular. Tribute to Ian McLaren in the winter issue, and a tribute to Buddy the Seagull, which is a lovely story, in the spring. So those went in the mail for those people who are waiting for the paper copies. They are coming shortly. I apologize for the delay. It's been a little slow for a couple different reasons, partly because of COVID and partly because of other issues that have come up with getting the printing done, but they are done now. And Alex, I just wanted to make this one plug. I know that you do this every year, every month. We have a section now of the magazine called Through the Aperture. And if you have a photo that you would like to have published in the magazine, you think you have a nice story around why you took the photo, what your experience was of that photo, you should contact Alex and submit that information and the photo for publication. I'm sure, Alex, we may get more than you can handle, but I thought it'd be great to let people know about this. Okay, having said that, I just want to take a moment and introduce Tyler Hoar. Tyler has taken over from Ron Pittaway. Ron Pittaway, as people probably remember, worked on the Winter Finch Network to try to understand what's happening with winter finches in Canada and why we have eruptions into more southern parts of Canada and United States. Tyler's taken over this position just recently, but Tyler has a long history of doing birding surveys and other biological work. Tyler's original from Oshawa, Ontario. And you're now living where, Tyler?
Still in Oshawa.
Okay, good for you. Good for you.
Some days it's good.
Yeah. And again, thank you, Richard, for the use of your photo. The evening grosbeak photo is from Angela McDonald. And this is a picture that the picture on the right-hand side is a picture I took on the way home from a drive that I was taking yesterday. I was out on an errand, and on the way home, I thought, well, they're not starlings. And they weren't, they were becoming waxwings. So we are seeing a lot of winter finches this year. And of course, that's really interesting and exciting for us because during this time of the year, there's not very many birds in Nova Scotia. So we welcome the opportunity to see the common redpolls and evening grosbeaks and finches, all kinds of, not very many purple finches, but many other types of finches. So having said all that, Tyler, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much for having me. Just let me share the screen here. 1 second. There we go. Everyone see that? Well, thank you for having me. Hope you've enjoyed your finches so far. It's been, the birds exceeded what we thought they would do. This is a nice little flock of common redpolls and their favorite thing, lamb's quarters. If you can find weedy fields with lamb's quarters, common redpolls love that, the seeds of that plant. So, okay, the winter finch forecast. Ron Pittaway started this in 1999, and he tinkered with it till about 2003. Then he had his format with the trees and each species. I started doing this for Ron. I do a lot of work in Northern Ontario, in Northwestern Quebec. So Ron knew I was going up there, so he had me actually stop and look at trees. And now I spend probably a week a year just looking at trees. Ron's his enthusiasm is very infectious. He's built this from a small Ontario little forecast to becoming Eastern North American, now North American. Us Canadian birders really look forward to it, but from talking to American birders and seeing the enthusiasm and the questioning when Ron decided to retire and I took over, found out for the Americans, it's almost like a cult. They are, it's like Christmas to them when this report comes out. 2020, we had a few challenges. COVID-19 in a lot of Northern Canada, the First Nations communities, a lot of small communities basically shut down all travel into the communities. So a lot of our forecasts were from biologists and foresters who go up to these small northern communities areas and work, but they weren't allowed up there this year. So they couldn't give me cone crops there. And I had, from when Ron handed the reins over to me and time of the forecast, I had 5 weeks to get a hold of people, myself drive 2,700 kilometers in 3 days looking at cone crop in Ontario and Quebec and try to get this forecast out for all the people. These are the tree species that are sampled to determine the amount of food for the finches and all that. The species Eastern white pine and red pine are quite important species for red crossbills. The next one, next to white spruce and black spruce, and in the Maritimes, red spruce, basically drive a huge amount of the eruptions. If the boreal forest has a great crop of white spruce or black spruce, like in 2019, we had almost a generational bumper crop of spruce, pine, everything in the boreal forest had a great crop, and the birds just never left. They stayed up there all winter long, and the white-winged crossbills bred 3 times. The other species, the birches, they're very important for the smaller finches, like the redpolls and the siskins. And this year, the birches, basically, other than the swamp birch up in the Hudson Bay lowlands, basically everywhere throughout North America, the birch crop was pretty much a complete failure. And when we were doing the swamp bird surveys, we were wondering if it was enough to hold the red poles. And if it wasn't, we knew the red poles were going to come. And boy, did they come. And the lesser crops here, the maples, the ashes, the red cedars are more for the pine and evening grosbeaks. And the red cedars are a major food source for Bohemian waxwings. If they can find it, they love it. So Ron developed a cone rating system here between, it's just a general one, and I send out to all the people who volunteer to look at trees for me. It's between bumper, excellent, good, all the way down to fair and poor. The tree here is between excellent and bumper. And in 2019, as I said, we had a widespread crop right across the whole boreal forest. The trees were all looking, the white spruce on the left, the tamarack on the right were just loaded full of cones. These pictures are from James Bay Coast, lower James Bay Coast, where I was working on shorebirds with Canada Wildlife Service. We were getting in August between 6 to 1,200 white-winged crossbills a day migrating by, coming from the north. And the first ones that arrived were bringing their young with them, and then they just left the young alone, and they started breeding again because the comb crop was so heavy. So you'd have males singing on territory, the females would be on eggs, and their babies who just fledged weeks beforehand are on their own, just having a great time eating all the cones. So you see, it's primarily an Ontario focus in terms of people supplying information. That's something we want to expand on. But Ron has built up from Newfoundland all the way up into Central Alaska, people who will go out there and look at trees for us and tell us what their judgment call on, what they see as the crops. This is basically what our crop looks like this year. This is good to excellent black spruce and white spruce crop. And right now, vast majority of the white-winged crossbills are sitting in there right now. From the Lake Superior eastward into Labrador, what cone crops and berry crops are there went from poor to absolutely terrible in Labrador. We found that out when Tadoussac Bird Observatory had a flight of several days of 100 plus boreal chickadees heading southwest out of Sept-Îles in southern Labrador. And then the pine grosbeaks came out a week later, and they were getting 300-400 some days, the pine grosbeaks heading southwest. So we knew that information, which we couldn't tell from COVID-19 because we couldn't get up there, was that the crop was a complete failure. But from the red line here, in this corner here, the berry crop is quite good going up that way, and that's still holding a lot of finches up in that part of the boreal forest. Our boreal forest here goes all the way into Alaska, coast to coast, and it's a home to a lot of finches. Sorry, this is more for the American audience because they don't know much about Canada, so I try to let them see what it looks like. And we'll get to our finches now. And one of the ones that have a lot of interest, and I was actually asked by a member of your group to provide some more information, the white-winged crossbills. Right now, the vast majority of the white-winged crossbills in North America are in that area to the red, west of Lake Superior, up into Alaska, and into the middle of British Columbia, where there's still a good cone crop. The Canadian population is 33 million, of which Ontario has 5 million. This year, we've had the biggest flight one-day report is of 1,800 white-winged crossbills in northern Minnesota flying southwest. Most of the white-winged crossbills went to the west. White-winged crossbills will follow cone crop around, like some else will follow lemmings around. One year they'll be here in big numbers, next year they won't. This year, the cone crop is better out west, so all the white-winged crossbills, not all, but probably 90% of the white-winged crossbills all went to western North America to feed on them. Next year, if the cone crop goes well in the east, they'll swing back to the east. This is to show the white-winged crossbills in central boreal. There's just small scatterings, except you see along the north shore of Lake Superior, there's a whole line of white-winged crossbills. Up in the left corner of the map there is where the edge of the good cone crop was. In mid-October, there was a major freezing rain event in northwestern Ontario and eastern Manitoba. 2 days later, on Lake Superior, they got a flight of 1,800 white-winged crossbills, and for about a week straight, they're getting 400 to 500 white-winged crossbills heading southwest along Lake Superior, and then going into Minnesota, Wisconsin, all that. Talking to biologists up here in northwestern Ontario, it didn't surprise them because all the comb crop was still there, but it was all encrusted in ice, so the birds couldn't get any food. And they decided it's best just to leave, and they left en masse. This is what the white-winged crossbills look like in early winter, late fall. That movement of white-winged crossbills on Lake Superior is so thick there, and you see they were moving in a southwest direction. They're all along Lake Michigan, but the state of Michigan itself had very few white-winged crossbills because they're coming in, the main flight was coming in from the northwest. In the east here, these white-winged crossbills were moving out from Quebec, Labrador, and Northern Ontario straight south looking for food, because what food they had up here was very poor crops and localized. Or December and January, they're getting more localized here. And this is more for our talk tonight. You can see in July and August, there's a band of reports and sightings all along the south coast of Nova Scotia and southern Maine, and New Brunswick. And you see the St. Lawrence. What we figure, these birds were drifting south after these comb crop here failed this year, and they were finding food source along the coast here, and they were staying there. And this is between the winter and the fall. They were coming down, breeding, and there's still some breeding, and the white-winged crossbills have slowly started moving down the coast into New England. And if you see here, Quebec City, Montreal, Ottawa, in the Greater Toronto area, they're all almost their own clusters, because in central Canada, I don't know what Nova Scotia is like in the urban areas, but in central Canada, there is basically no comb crop whatsoever in the forest. The forests are pretty much barren zones for food for these winter finches. So they come into the cities, and our exotic spruces, the Norway spruce, the Colorado blue spruce, they have a comb crop. So if you want to see crossbills in central and eastern Canada, you don't go out to the forest and go to the legendary places like Algonquin Park or Gatineau Park. You go into downtown parks, you go into cemeteries with old spruces that are full of Norway spruces, and the crossbills are right there. And talking to coworkers in the Boston area, they're sitting there going up, same things. In the cemeteries, in the old subdivisions with the good ornamental plantings of mature spruces, the white-winged crossbills are there, and they're not seeing them outside of the towns. They're all basically become urban this winter. And along the coast, from Maine down into Maryland, there was an ornamental planting from the 40s and 50s that was put in there of a tree species called the Japanese black pine. It's similar to our red pine, and the red and white-winged crossbills have taken a big liking to it. So much so, I'll show you a slide in a second. The red crossbills are all along the coast from Maine all the way down into Virginia, right along the coast on these plantations of Japanese black pines. This is what currently the white-winged crossbills are for the winter. The darker the purple is the higher the percentage of eBird checklists that actually have white-winged crossbills. You can see they're all in the east. There's white-winged crossbills reported, but generally it's a lighter pink, so it's not heavy density. But you see towards where the red line I had there, the polygon, it's still darker darker reports. So it's a higher density of reports that are showing white-winged crossbills that are still enjoying that food source that's out there. Up in the far northwest in Yukon and Alaska, observers up there were telling me they were having bumper crops of white spruce. And in August and September, they were just overrun with white-winged crossbills still. So with a population in Canada of 33 million white-winged crossbills, they have to go somewhere. And they breed in such low densities when they're spread out. It shows we have a very big country. But they're all, vast majority of them are in the West right now. The wood crossbill, which has many different call types, that they've actually even changed one call type that's from the mountains in Idaho into its own species called the Cassia crossbill. It doesn't migrate. But in the east, we have a crossbill. Doing more research on it, they call it the type 10. It's the eastern crossbill. It is primarily a lover of white pine and red pine cone crops. There's approximately 175,000 birds in this population. And this summer, they were all concentrated in areas of up Peninsula Michigan, Eastern Ontario, New England, where there's a great crop of white pines, and the white pines had a really good crop. So all these red crossbills were in there happily breeding. And then as the fall progressed, they just exploded back out and were moving south after they were cleaning their cone crop they had. And they were moving, looking for their food source. And in the Maritimes here, they were here in the summer too, right along same place where the white-winged crossbills are. Showed up in August in the early fall, the South Shore of Nova Scotia. They've taken a big liking to what cone crop you have there, and along New England and Maine. And now you see that they're right along, primarily, they love being right along close to the coast where that ornamental pine is actually has a good cone crop. And again, like the white-winged crossbills, you can see where Montreal is, Ottawa, and the Toronto area, because all the ornamental spruces where the only food source for these two species are right now. So if you want to see a crossbill, I would go birding in older subdivisions in the cities, because that's where they're looking for what food source they can find. If you can find a woodlot that actually has a fair amount of cones, I would look at it again and again all through spring, because they'll start to breed there if the cone crop is heavy enough for them. They will breed any time of the year. And here we have the pine siskin. Some people call it the mutt of the finch world. It's not the prettiest one, but they are very charismatic and they are tricky. There was a large population of them reported in Western Canada all through the summer and early fall, and that's where we thought most of them were. And then October, they started coming and heading south and southeast out of the Western Boreal Forest in huge numbers. But we also learned, which I'll talk a little bit later in the talk about the spruce bloodworms, there's also quite a few that are up in the spruce bloodworms outbreaks in Quebec that weren't showing themselves to any birders or biologists because they were away from civilization and they're quite happily eating spruce bloodworm larvae. This species exploded southward. In August, they were still sitting in their regular spots on southern edge of the breeding Canada, and then they just started September, started moving in big numbers straight south. They were going, some species were moving southwest, some were moving southeast. The pine siskins basically just went straight south in huge numbers. They were getting flocks in New Jersey of 1,500 in the morning just pouring through. In November 2019, we had a good cone crop. They were all up in the boreal forest, in the edge of the boreal forest across in small numbers. This year, they moved down, and you see the darker the purple is. The latest map is from basically North Carolina into West Texas. If you look at any feeder cameras online, from that area, from North Carolina to, was it the West Texas bird feeder camera, which is near the New Mexico border, probably the most common bird you'll see in these feeder cameras are pine siskins. They have went down in huge numbers, and in April and May, they'll be coming back up in huge numbers. So just when you think you should take your feeder down, the pine siskins and the purple finches will be returning in big numbers coming up. There are charismatic little friends. The bird that people love to see, and sometimes people get very aggravated because they don't see them, because they do move around quite a bit. They're charismatic little guys. I always tell people, if you see a good weedy field of goldenrod or aster or lamb's quarters, and if you don't see any redpolls in that feeder, drive back there 20 minutes later. There's a good chance you'll see them, because they'll pop up, fly across the field, drop back down, eat, forage heavily, and you won't see them. You turn your back and all of a sudden they just pop right back up and move over 20 feet and then drop back down. Difference between common and hoary redpolls. Hoaries are much whiter, much of a frosted look, a smaller bill, whitish rump feathers. They can have a little bit of variance there. They can have some pink, and sometimes they have a little bit of darkness, but they can have a fair amount of pink on their rumps. They're much lighter and frosted look. Redpoll, the common redpolls, darker dingy brown. They get much more pink on their breast and a deeper red. And they're much more common than our hoaries. The hoary redpoll breeds up in the high Arctic, and if Santa Claus had a bird feeder, the hoary redpoll would be at its bird feeder all summer long. Common redpolls breed in the northern boreal forest and just above the tree line where the hoary redpolls start to take over in the breeding. They're charismatic survivalists. These birds will happily, if the food source is there, they will happily stay up in northern Quebec, northern Ontario, Northwest Territories. They won't come down. They will happily survive there. Areas where temperature gets averages minus 27 at night, sometimes get down to minus 40 Celsius at night in the winter. These little guys will just sit there, and in the late afternoon, they'll just jump off a tree branch and poke a hole right in the snow and burrow down about a foot or so into the fluffy snow and sleep there overnight to keep warm. And the next morning, just working their way and popping back up out. There was a study done in Alaska where they wanted to see how tough these redpolls were. So they tried to freeze them. They found that common redpolls could survive a temperature down to minus 53 Celsius. And hoary redpolls, being a more northern bird, survived temperatures down to minus 67 Celsius. So something the size of that big can survive that cold is quite impressive. One of their techniques is you'll see them come to feeders, Niger feeders, and they're just gorging on your Niger feeder or black oil seeds, and taking everything they can. They have a little pouch in their esophagus where they can jam full of seeds. So they can have their throat almost bulging out here of so many seeds are sitting there, and then they'll fly into a spruce tree or a cedar tree or hedge or something where it's nice and warm and just digest their meal, and then come back out there to gorge again on the seeds before they go. This is the map of the Ontario one, how they push down most of these. This is from October, but unfortunately eBird, I wish eBird would let you break their stuff down by week, because all these red dots here for October, they're all the last 2 weeks of October. And then November, they just exploded south for us. And this is the current eruption as of yesterday, from December to yesterday, of all the common redpolls in the east. Newfoundland didn't get in on this. Northern New Brunswick doesn't have it. Nova Scotia has it more in the Bay of Fundy, it looks like. But the St. Lawrence River Valley from eastern Ontario all through Quebec is absolutely jammed with redpolls right now. Why? We have in these areas the first big agricultural fields these birds have seen since they left northern Quebec and that. And there's a lot of old weedy fields, and a lot of these areas didn't have heavy snowfall for the first part of the winter. So these birds, instead of getting snowed out and having their food covered by snow, all the seeds were there. So they kept stacking up and stacking up, but huge numbers have come down all the way to Pennsylvania. They're into West Virginia, and a couple have made it into North Carolina. And the southern U.S. birders are absolutely adorable, because they see one redpoll and they think it's the greatest thing on earth, which it's equivalent of us in Canada seeing a painted bunting. It's very rare for us to see that, and it's very rare for them to see the redpolls. So in the east, I can't really show in the west. The west, the common redpolls go up in the Manitoba U.S. border, and they're much less. It's primarily this year. There's lots of redpolls across the country, but it's primarily from Lake Ontario eastward that has the highest density of them. For those who want to see hoary redpolls, I heard the talk earlier about chasing the white whale. This year is the best hoary redpoll year in record for decades. This is on the map on the left is the previous 5 years of winter records of hoary redpolls in eastern Canada. There's 2 eBird records from the New Brunswick, Nova Scotia border, and then that St. Lawrence Valley. This year, they're all the way down in New York City, up through Nova Scotia, and they're just a huge line with the common redpolls. In Ontario, we're probably having our best hoary redpoll winter in decades. Instead of it used to be, you'd see 300-400 common redpolls, you might get 1 hoary. Sometimes you see a flock of 10 common redpolls and there's 2 hoaries with them. But they have come over. We have another few weeks before the redpolls really start to move north. They start moving north in about mid-March, and by early April, the vast majority have already left. So you have a few more weeks to hunt down your hoary redpoll. Any weedy fields you can find that have common redpolls, look for the hoaries. I find when the redpolls come to feeders, most of the first part of the winter, these redpolls don't even know what feeders are. Most of them, these birds have never seen a feeder before. So it takes them a while to figure out what feeders are. So what I do on my feeder is I get redpolls, they don't know what to do. So I spread some Niger seed on the ground below the feeder, and they will go straight to the ground and eat the Niger seed on the ground. And for every redpoll that actually comes to the feeder, I'll have 10, 20 on the ground. And here is the bird I heard here. Now, one of your members actually has a few of these. The purple finch is the bird that will leave Canada when we have a bad cone crop. They'll leave Canada in huge numbers, and they're usually one of the first ones to go. And this year they were the first finch to go. You get the males with a nice full raspberry head, and the females, which I think personally is just as attractive as the male, the brown and the white spotting, the nice brown through the eyes. Several people will mistake these with house finches, but the house finches don't have a very deep raspberry coloration all across them. We were wondering why we've been seeing more purple finches in eastern North America. This was 5 previous years, early 2010, 2015, in Ontario and Western New York. These are the small breeding populations. This year, we started seeing pairs of purple finches breeding all over places in eastern North America where we haven't seen them. And then we knew something was up before it even took over the reins from Ron Pittaway. The purple finches started to leave Canada. They were showing up in spots that rarely never sees them. Downtown Toronto, they were all over Detroit. They were moving through Montreal into Boston in good numbers. And then they kept pushing into the winter, and the Americans had lots of purple finches in Canada and northern Michigan, that the purple finches were disappearing in Quebec. This was a summer, 2020. You see the purple finch, dark purple, where lots of purple finches are in the southern boreal forest, all through the Maritimes. And now by November, they're all down in the southern US, central US. They've actually even made records in New Mexico, down into the Key West in Florida. They've actually made it down this year, which is, I think, first ones in 20 plus years to actually make that far south in Florida. And here in the north, they're few and far between, and they're basically stuck on feeders. They will start coming back up when we see the pine siskins start showing up in late April in good numbers, and the rose-breasted grosbeaks start showing up. You'll see in your bird feeders, you'll see the purple finches come in on their migration back north. There are species that are on the increase for a certain locality, spruce budworms, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes, but their explosion. They are driving evening grosbeaks, purple finches, and pine siskins. A significant part of their diet when there's an outbreak becomes spruce budworm. And for those 3 species, they're all on the increase because of that one little caterpillar. And the pine grosbeak, the bird that does not want to go south. Through it does breed in Cape Breton and northern New Brunswick and northern Maine. This bird across most of the boreal forest does not want to come anywhere near people. It quite happily will stay up there in the dead of winter eating buds of spruce trees or tamaracks or the odd seeds it can find. They're very resilient and beautiful little birds, which right about this time of year, they'll start singing down here, which will catch you off guard. You're hearing voices you don't really hear. It quite happily will stay there, eat the buds, drink, get its water from eating the snow. The lovely male on the left, the immature male or female on the right. They came down this year, but they came down primarily in the east and not in the central or the west. This is how the usual range is in the winter, is to north of Toronto, midway through the Great Lakes. They've come down that far. Then by November, we noticed something like Tadoussac, as they came out of Labrador and northeastern Quebec. They were coming by Tadoussac by the hundreds. And they came down the St. Lawrence, the north shore of St. Lawrence. They didn't want to cross St. Lawrence until around Quebec City, where the river was narrow enough. They just poured straight south into New England in large numbers. Between you and me, Ontario and Nova Scotia, there's a lot of pine grosbeaks sitting in Maine and New England states right now that decided to go south between us. And our areas in central and southern Ontario, the pine grosbeak started moving south, but then we have, I don't know if you have in Nova Scotia, ornamental crab apples. Ornamental crab apples and mountain ash berries. Robins love them, that, but pine grosbeaks absolutely adore them. And in all these small towns on the edge of the Canadian Shield, where a lot of people have their cottages and small towns, they do a lot of this planting of ornamental crab apples. We thought in November that they would come right down into the cities in southern Ontario. They hit these towns that had these good crab apple ornamental planting, fruit bushes and that, and they just stopped dead in their tracks. They're still there. Some are starting to move back north, but they love it because they go to someone's front yard and it's 2 crab apple trees of hundreds of fruit berries that they don't even have to do any work for. This is the current distribution as of today. About two hours for the talk, I got this map out to do it. You can see the dark purple and the distribution of the pine grosbeak. So they came down north shore of St. Lawrence, right around Quebec City where the river got really narrow. They just crossed and went straight south. And in Maine all the way to New York, eastern New York State, they're all over the place right now. Here in towards the Great Lakes area, they stopped just north of the urban areas where all these ornamental plantings are. And in the east here, some would cross to Newfoundland or did cross here, and also you have your population of Cape, that bring Cape Breton and the Gaspé and that have slowly moved by. These birds are going to have to go back north to northeast. I got a feeling some are going to stray further east before they go north. But usually this cluster, you see a cluster in northwestern Quebec, northeastern Ontario. There are a bunch of small little towns there. Each town has their own, a couple little bird feeders. And once there's no food around there, these pine grosbeaks showed up late. They found these bird feeders and no other birds, and they quite happily will stay in these towns if there's a bird feeder. And here we have probably the king and queen of winter finches, what everyone wants to see, the greedies. And everyone talks about the big stories back in the 70s and 80s, how they would show up in your bird feeders and clean out your bird feeders, and you see flocks upon flocks. And then they disappeared in the 80s. This species came in the 20s and 30s from Western North America, following spruce budworm outbreaks and following plantings of Manitoba maple. Manitoba maple have keys on the trees that will stay all winter long, providing a source of food for them. So they followed those ornamental plantings eastward, and then they got into the mixed deciduous southern boreal forest with the cherries and the maples and the ashes, and that was a good food source. But then the spruce budworms exploded. They started exploding in the 60s till the early 80s, and this species during breeding season, 80% of their diet will become spruce budworms if there's an outbreak. So the areas now we have of large outbreaks, these birds are thick in there, and they're having not just 1 or 2 young, they're having big clutches, and they're raising all their kids quite happily. That's why we're finding this year was the biggest eruption of this species southward, probably in about 30, 40 years. They came south in huge numbers out of Quebec. So yes, if you do see any of these birds, the vast majority of them, say bonjour to them because they are French speaking. This is the previous 4 winters in Nova Scotia all the way to Quebec of all evening grosbeak records in eBird. And on the right is this January and February of this year of how many evening grosbeaks have erupted in here. They primarily went again southwest of Nova Scotia, but lots did come into Nova Scotia to join in, because up here in Gas Bay is one of the big outbreaks of spruce budworms, and has of getting reports of several hundred evening grosbeaks moving southward out of there in October. So the birds had come south into Nova Scotia, into Maine, and a lot have headed southwest. This is how big this eruption is. This is all the eBird record for 10 previous winters in eastern North America. And this is this January, February of this winter. There's big clusters that made it to Tennessee, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Virginia are just full of these birds in the mountains. And there's one in Tallahassee in October, and there's one currently at a feeder in Orlando right now. They have pushed that far south that Florida hasn't seen them in decades, that individuals have actually made it that far south. But there was earlier in October on a webpage of Pennsylvania birders, they were having a contest to see if each county in Pennsylvania could get an evening grosbeak. And it got down to where in mid-November, there's only 2 counties that did not have an evening grosbeak yet, but now they all do, so they're all quite happy. But they had a huge push in the Missouri that we have not seen this in years, which is telling us that their population is totally booming because of the spruce budworms. In Ontario, we had an event that hasn't happened since 1972. I had to look at a lot of literature to try to find this. Every diamond here is where we had over 100 evening grosbeaks fly by in one day. And the stars are where there's over 500 evening grosbeaks that migrated through in one day. My house is over here, and I had 103 in one day come by. I had 238 fly over my house in the fall before one decided to stop my feeder for 2 days. They just kept on going overhead. You could hear them and watch them fly by, and you curse because you have a well-stocked feeder and they just didn't want to stop. Here are some of the counts that we had this year. Hot Cliff on Lake Erie, north of Cleveland, in the middle of the lake, middle of the North Shore, they had 905 go by in one day. The Bluff, which is on Eastside Lake Huron, 575. Then we thought that was great. And then October 30th, we had a huge push of evening grosbeaks through Ontario, all heading southwest into the US Midwest. Downtown Toronto, about 3 kilometers away from the CN Tower, they had 415 flyby. On Lake Erie, 450. Areas down there, Point Pelee, 400, almost 450, and 1,300 evening grosbeaks in one day, all heading southwest, not stopping. They were just moving. And we were wondering in the literature, why are they doing this? Because we thought when we were forecasting this that yes, they would come, but we figured they would slowly work their way through and drop some individuals off at each little feeder on the way through. We had 3 waves come through. The first 2 waves, the October 24th, 25th wave, and the 30th wave, they just went through Ontario. They went through Ontario, they went to New York State, they were just gone. No one knew what happened to them. Then we had a 3rd wave come through in mid-November that filled some of the back traditional areas that evening grosbeak stop at. They stopped there and overwintered. Looking at the literature, we have not seen this since 1972. The species do this. In 1969, November 8th, Toronto had 500. These other next two are in the Hamilton area in the west end of Lake Ontario. October 24th, 1972, they had 2,800 evening grosbeaks go through. 11 days later, they had another big push go through. All just flocks not stopping and going through. And this year is the first year I could find on record that this species did this again. Usually they slowly just work their way down, stopping at feeders, but this year they decided it was time to make a big push. So we started looking at more of the data. We realized the spruce budworms are really exploding the outbreaks in eastern and northeastern Ontario and in Quebec. This species is exploding in population. We're seeing numbers of this species that we haven't seen since the early 80s in eastern North America. This is how far the eruption has already gone to the east. You see it's primarily in the east. In the northwest here, those evening grosbeaks haven't left the boreal because they have food, and they don't have spruce budworm outbreaks. Well, all this big push here, the birds went south into Nova Scotia and southwest into the US deep south. People are seeing birds down there they haven't seen in years. David Yeaney, out of the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy, is putting MODIS tags on them. So when they come by, these little tags, if anyone's familiar with them, there's these MODIS towers that come up, and if a bird shows up with one of these tags within a few kilometers of it, the tower will pick it up. And each one of these little tags, computer tags, have their own little signature. So the computer that's at the tower will record the signature so you know which individual birds come through. David in 2018 started doing this, and one of his birds came up, flew up towards Lake Erie, and flew around Lake Erie. Instead of crossing the lake, it flew around the lake, did another fly around Lake Ontario, went up to Algonquin Park. He was thinking, okay, it's going to go Northern Ontario, and then all of a sudden it turned right and then went to Gaspé. So how they're going to come back, we're going to find out this year, because we've funded David to put 20 more tags on these birds this year to hopefully find out and track which way they're going. Will they head east and go north? Will they go north and then go east, or will they just head straight back towards home? And this is our little critter that I was talking about, and so many of our finch desires and dreams all depend on this little critter. Like the 3 species of warblers that are known as the spruce budworm warblers, the Tennessee, the bay-breasted, and the Cape May warbler. Those 3 warblers are on the increase heavily because this little caterpillar is having a big outbreak now. These 3 finch species, the pine siskin, the purple finch, and evening grosbeak, also, like those warblers, will shift their diet heavily to feed on spruce budworms. And once the spruce budworms pupate to become caterpillars, the caterpillars will lay their egg masses and that. The evening grosbeak and the purple finch will shift to berries, looking for wild cherries and blueberries and that to feed on. The pine siskins, being resilient little ones, start feeding on the egg cases of the spruce budworms and the very young caterpillars that hatch in August. So they were hidden up in the boreal forest, while the purple finches and the evening grosbeak started being shown up in the southern boreal forest and in towns. People started noticing them. These 3 species, up to 89% of their diet when there's an outbreak will be spruce budworms because it's an easy food source. Just imagine having 5 hungry males to feed, and instead of flying around for 20 minutes, they just have to go to the next tree, grab a mouthful, and there's one kid quiet, and get all the kids quiet in a couple minutes. So they were exploding in their populations. This is what spruce budworms do. They lay their eggs in the tips of the branches, and they eat all the fresh needles. The trees can usually survive. The primary trees that the spruce budworms eat are balsam firs and white spruces, and to a lesser extent, apparently red spruces and black spruce. The trees can survive about 3 to 5 years of these outbreaks before they're basically dead. And then you have to have problems with forest fires. So this is August after spruce budworms in northeastern Ontario got after some of these spruces. All the new young growth was eaten away. And you drive by the highway and all the forest has this brownish tinge to them. The bass spruce budworm outbreaks match with the evening grosbeaks and the purple finches' previous highs. Our peak was in 1980, Quebec's was in 1975, and Eastern Canada, New Brunswick and Quebec primarily, was in 1975 too. 52 million hectares. That's a huge, huge area. That's like about 5.2 million square kilometers. Currently, these are the areas of the spruce budworm outbreaks in 2020. The huge one up here in the North Shore from Tadoussac to Sept-Îles and well up in the Gaspé, to the New Brunswick border is very bad too, but New Brunswick is spraying heavily for the last couple of years to try to stop the outbreak from moving southwest. And then you have number 3 here in the Quebec-Ontario border is growing in Ontario, and number 4 is a big one in Ontario too. These cycles last 30 to 40 years. Right now, we're close to 30 years since the lowest. And the way these spruce bodyworms are expanding, and it's going to keep growing, they spray these spruce bodyworms now. They don't use a chemical insecticide. They use a bacteria, a spore of a bacteria that they spray on the pine and spruce needles that the caterpillars will ingest. And it basically causes the caterpillars to starve slowly. It's a bacteria, so it's not a chemical one, but it's expensive to spray. So they figure, I'm talking to Forestry Canada biologists last week, they figure Ontario and Quebec will be spraying maybe 3 to 5% of the outbreak. So they won't be able to control it. Mother Nature will control it when it's time to go. They can just try to save some invaluable timber that's not that damaged yet by the caterpillars. These are the numbers here in Quebec alone of light damage, moderate damage, and severe damage. 2019, it was 9.6 million hectares. I just found out this week in Quebec, it's 14 million hectares as of 2020. It had a big, basically COVID didn't, no spraying and control of it. It basically had a 5 million hectare jump in bodyworm outbreak. So what that means is there's going to be a whole bunch more grosbeaks and purple finches and pine siskins in the next year or two. Well, the future goals of the talk is to expand cone crop reporters, particularly areas of underrepresentation. Any one of you guys here in the Maritimes want to look at pine cones and oaks and maple trees for me in August? I would greatly appreciate it. Because I have one reporter, David, in Cape Breton, and that's the only one I have between there and the Gaspé. I would love to get more information. The more people can look, the better. It gives a better view and a better understanding. I would like to increase the diversity of reporters, more First Nation communities, because most in the boreal forest, the primary people living there are the First Nation communities that are scattered across there. They can provide more of what their knowledge of the land. More a different, wider base of people who actually go out there into the forest and actually can stop and look at the trees. I don't want them to be addictive like me, where I sit there and I look at the Labor Day weekend. I drove 2,700 kilometers in 3 days, and I honestly looked at probably 20 to 30,000 trees. I would slow down at 10 miles an hour and just look at trees in the middle of nowhere going, yep, there's no cones, there's no food. And finally, the development document to assist more with the cone seed aging. So people with not much experience can understand when they're looking at a tree going, okay, that's an old cone or that's a new cone. Because some trees like white pine, red pine have a 2-year cone. It can have a cone on it, but it's not mature yet. It won't be good for another year. So I'm trying to help that out. And these are so far the wonderful people across North America who have provided me information this year, who actually went out and looked at cones. I would love to triple this in size. And now we have the Finch Research Network. It's biologists across Northern Hemisphere, primarily, mostly in North America, that we developed this website here. And we've tried to raise money to fund various projects. Like we're funding right now Red Crossbills, the Evening Grosbeak Project, and out west, the rosy finch projects, because rosy finches are an altitudinal species. They breed and live in the high mountains in Western North America, and the Rockies and all that. So global warming can have an effect on them because those birds can't move north into the boreal forest. It's either go to the top of the mountain or they're in trouble. So they're trying to do some radio tagging of that and figure out their movements. We try to provide relatively up-to-date information on what the finches are doing. I'm currently working on an article right now on the spring migration of birds, of first of all, the pine grosbeaks and the red poles. Both, little hint before the article comes out, both those species, if you'd like to see them, you have about 2 weeks before they really drop off. They'll still be around later, especially common red poles. Common red poles, after an eruption year, you have the odd stray and the odd injured bird that will stay into June in the south. So if someone tells you they saw a common redpoll this June, don't laugh at them. It's probably a good chance there is a common redpoll or two will be sitting in Nova Scotia this summer that did not go north. But the primarily the redpolls and the pine grosbeaks are going to head north in the next few weeks. Evening grosbeaks will start their migration back north, probably the end of March, all the way into mid-May. They'll be moving up because they don't want to arrive too soon because there's no food for them. Pine siskins, they'll be coming through, and purple finches will be coming through about mid-April through the Maritimes, all the way into about mid-May. So just when you think your feeders are done on that, these finches that went all the way down the Gulf Coast are coming back up and they're hungry. And all these cone crops that weren't here for them in the winter aren't here for them yet. So they will be looking at feeders pretty heavily on the way back north. And this is, thing is 2020, this is a rosy finch, a Pallas's rosy finch I saw in Japan last winter. I was jokingly putting in, going, yeah, 99% sure I forecast this species will not show up in North America. And then, has anyone heard about the haw finch that showed up in the Yukon this December? It was the first Canadian record of this Asian finch that usually winters in Japan. Once that one showed up, I realized 99% sure this species won't show up, but now I have to be 99% sure it won't show up because a bird that should never have shown up in North America, in Canada, showed up in Canada this year. So this one could show up next winter too. You never know. It breeds in the same place in Siberia. Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate the talk. Any questions I would love to answer. I'll try my best. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tyler. I'm going to watch this again because it's just packed with information. So much to learn. Thank you so much. We do have a question from Anne. I'll read the question to you. Does the spraying of the trees control the spraying of the trees that controls the spruce budworm? Does it have a negative effect on the health of the birds when they ingest them?
No, it's just a bacteria it affects the Lepidoptera, the moths and butterflies, caterpillar larvae. But they've tested it doesn't have an effect on anything that predates on them. They used to use some really nasty stuff, but basically it was as soon as it contacted the caterpillar would start dying, and then it'd go all up the food chain. But now it's not the most effective because the caterpillar has to eat the bacteria spores. When they do an aerial spray, has to get stuck to the pine and the spruce needles, and then the caterpillar has to actually eat those spruce needles before it rains. So, and then the spore has to germinate inside the gut of the caterpillar. So
does it take a long time for the caterpillar to die?
It basically starves it. Yeah. So the caterpillar, probably after ingesting the first bit and the spores germinating, it's probably less than a week. But it's expensive, and they can't stop the spruce budworms. Mother Nature is going to do it, but it does with every cycle. But one of the problems with spruce budworm, which New Brunswick really hates, is because it destroys your timber crop. But then also when it gets severe, it can kill large tracts of forest, which cause a lot of fuel for the next forest fire, and if they don't go in there and control it.
Right.
Like large areas in the Gas Bay are brown right
now. Anyone else have questions for Tyler? And take your mute off and just ask. Go ahead, Angela.
Yeah. Will there be a tipping point where the birds will win against the budworm, or does it just have to run its course over a few years no matter what?
It just runs its course. They just benefit from the budworms. If they exceed the budworms, they're basically destroying their food source too soon, and they'll be in big trouble. Like this year, why we think the purple finches and evening grosbeaks left in such huge numbers so quickly. I don't know if you had it in Nova Scotia, but in central Canada, Quebec, and Ontario, we had our third winter in May, just when a lot of our cherry and fruiting trees were just flowering. We had about a week of wintry weather, so there was no fruit, no cherries, nothing. You go through when I went to the boreal forest, I was looking at thousands of pin cherry trees, which should have had some cherries on them still, and not a single thing was on them. So purple finches and even grosbeaks were looking all the caterpillars went to pupa or went adults, and they went to their secondary food source, and it wasn't there. So they realized we're in trouble, and they started leaving quickly. So if they eat themselves out of house and home, they're in trouble. But like most things in nature, it's all cyclical. Some cycles, like the typical one you learn in science class, is the lynx and snowshoe hare. How the lynx cycles behind the snowshoe hare and expands and crashes with its food source. These guys do it too, but it's a longer cycle. Like 30, 40 years is a much longer cycle than 7, 8 years.
Yeah, I didn't realize it was that long cycle. Graham has a question. He says, I noticed when you showed the large map of the boreal forest, it looked as if Nova Scotia was excluded. And I'm with him about this too. I'm curious what the Nova Scotia forests are classified as. I've always thought of them as boreal, as some type of boreal forest.
I think they have subclassified them as a maritime forest now. I don't know the exact reasoning how they did that, but I think they call them a maritime forest because you have more red spruce down there. Hmm. Yeah, it's open to interpretation. Some maps of the boreal forest, they had the boreal forest right down to Lake Ontario in my backyard, and I have no boreal forest within not even an acre of it within 2 hours of me of black spruce. It's all different interpretations. I even saw one map where they had in southwest Greenland had it mapped as boreal forest. Hmm. So I actually went on the internet and tried to see if there wasn't actually a chunk of stuff I didn't know about. No, it's just all people make the maps differently. This is different interpretation. I was trying to find something that was mostly representative of the boreal forest.
Richard, why don't you go ahead and ask your question?
Oh, I just put it on the chat. But my question was, do we know why the cone crop varies so much either from year to year or every few years? What affects the cone crop?
There's a source that I've been told, I actually read about too. It's a defense mechanism because a lot of these trees have evolved with red squirrels, and red squirrels will take all the cones. So some years these tree crops put so much food out there to try to beat the red squirrels, and then next year they've expended so much energy they don't produce crop out there, and the red squirrels will crash.
Huh, my goodness.
Amazing.
Like when I worked up in James Bay at Coastal Shorebirds in 2018, what cones we had, the red squirrels cleaned out and they were getting into our camp. In 2019, we had more cones than we could count. And I think in 6 weeks, I saw a red squirrel twice because they didn't need to come near us. So I've told you, it's a defense system the trees have evolved to deal with the squirrels.
Neat. Ken had another question. Is the bacteria specific to the SBW, or does it also affect other leps?
It does affect other leps as well. Okay. They do use it to deal with hemlock looper, jack pine budworm. But yeah, it does affect the leps, what leps it gets, and that's why they try to spray it specifically on outbreak areas. So it tries to minimize what else it affects. Because usually you get some of these areas where the budworms are starting to expand. And last year they get the high densities. Last year they actually saw, when the spruce budworms were flying, they saw them on the radar in Quebec. They actually had it and they thought it was raining, and it was just the radar picking up so many budworms flying.
Eric, I noticed you took your mute off. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I do have a question, or at least I have a comment, and that is that we've noticed here, we're surrounded by red spruce and white spruce forest where I live in southwestern Nova Scotia. And in years of drought, which are becoming increasingly common, the spruces produce more cones. Now, there seems to be a direct relationship between the drought and the abundance of cones. So the trees are saying, in quotation marks, help, I'm dying. I've got to reproduce and produce more spruces. So I'm wondering if there is a link between rainfall, and especially lack of rainfall, and the production of cones. That's certainly subject to some kind of experimental demonstration, which I don't think has ever been done, but it's noteworthy here anyway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you guys are much a much wetter climate than most of the boreal forest. So yeah, the drought wouldn't be stressing the trees locally quite heavily. Like in the main boreal forest in the central Canada and northwestern Canada, where they don't have a maritime climate, it's dry, it's cold in the winter, or it's dry and hot in the summer with some passing fronts. But it's basically a lot of the boreal forest in central Canada away from the coast. You have a poor crop, then a better crop, then a poor crop, a better crop usually. Sometimes you get poor, better, excellent. Then it's basically what happened. The trees pushed themselves too hard for us in most of Canada, and they didn't produce anything this year. When I did the 2,700 kilometer drive, I looked at thousands of balsam firs. I saw one tree with cones. And for us, red-breasted nuthatches feed heavily on balsam fir cones, the seeds. They had no food, so they were leaving the boreal forest in central Canada in June and July. They didn't even breathe. They were just moving out. It'd be interesting to see someone, forestry department in the Maritimes, wouldn't surprise me if they're thinking about trying to do a study like that, seeing what the climatic changes does in the local forest.
Yeah.
Gary and Jean Myatt just commented that, are they Acadian forest in Nova Scotia, which is a term I've heard before as well.
That sounds right.
Yeah. Any other questions, folks? Gerard Cormier. I think Joan maybe just took her mute off, but maybe not.
Right. Yeah. Do we know, is there any data yet, or is it too early to say about long-term trends for any of these finches in terms of their total Canadian or total boreal populations? Like, are any of them known to be increasing over the last 50 years, or and I don't mean with sort of short-term fluctuations related to cone crops, but in general terms, are any of them actually endangered at the moment, or do we know anything else?
The evening grosbeaks were classified in 2016 as special concern in Canada. That's just before the spruce budworms really exploded in eastern Canada. Now the Bird Observatory at Tadoussac has noticed a marked increase in the banding and migration numbers of evening grosbeaks that are expanding, and we're figuring that species and purple finch and pine citizens are definitely seen to be on the increase because they're benefiting from the outbreak. And how long they benefit from it, we will see. They will drop again, unfortunately. But a lot of the other species seem to be holding their own right now. But I was reading in the Maritime Atlas, the pine grosbeaks that breed in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick locally, between the two atlases, there's been a significant decline, which something like that is like climate change, where they're colder climates and habitats they prefer are being changed now. I worked in the high Arctic for a couple summers in the early 2000s, and just in a 5-year difference, I was seeing species. There's just all these hoary redpolls, and all of a sudden, 3 years into it, more and more common redpolls just started showing up. So, but for the finch wise, most of them seem to be doing okay. Even grosbeaks are rebounding, but in terms of really good concrete data, I don't think there is that, because these species, they breed in the boreal and they're really hard to track properly across the numbers. Because like species like pine grosbeaks, when they leave to go north in the summer, 99% of them are nowhere near roads. So a lot of these populations are estimates, the best that they can try to do.
Susan wants to know if you can tell us a little bit more about the cone counting and assessing. And I think it's like, what are you looking for volunteers?
People who are eager and don't mind looking at trees, looking aimlessly, glassed over eyes, staring at trees. we ask people to go out there and use the July when the cone crops are starting to mature and the berry crops and see what you're seeing. Is a tree looking heavy? Is it what you think from your experience looking at the tree? Is it look like an average crop? Are the branches being bent over like a bumper crop will? Like stuff like mountain ash. If you see a lot of trees with a really good flowering crop, like lots of flowers on the trees, unless you have a bad weather event, you should have a pretty good berry crop. And I am developing a document for beginners to look at so they can understand more what to justify and give us and do it a point system more instead of saying some people think is fair, some person may say is poor. So I'm trying to give a scale of 1 to 10, just to what you thought is. 5 would be average. Do you think it's average what you're used to seeing? And having diagrams like what a young tamarack cone looks like and what an old tamarack cone looks like, so people can have a better idea. And once I get that document made and reviewed, I'd happily share it for anyone who wants to glaze their eyes looking at trees.
Yeah, we have some we have some members that are very, strong foresters as well. So I'm sure
that would be great.
Yeah. Billy said that you mentioned the population of white-winged crossbills. I think you may have mentioned the population of red crossbills as well.
Yes.
What about the other finches?
The other finches in eastern, for evening grosbeaks, it is last estimate was 600,000 in eastern Canada. That was 4 years ago. I bet you it's probably closer to 1 million now because budworms. Siskins and pine grosbeaks, I could not find an accurate one. There's a lot of variable estimates because they are fairly hard to sample. I was actually surprised when they said the Canadian population was estimated to be 33 million. I thought that was a little high, but fair estimate. But yeah, the red crossbills being 170, that's the eastern population. There's more red crossbills that breed all throughout Western North America, from Alaska all the way down to Mexico. We just have a slightly different group that are over here that sounds slightly different. And if you go to the Finch Research Network website there, they have a very detailed description of all the different finch types and the audio calls of the different finches that you can hear in flight calls, or for the red crossbills, every different call type, what they sound slightly different. They all have a slightly different dialect. And there's 11 different types of red crossbills now. They speak slightly different. And then you get the ones in the old world, the red crossbills that breed in Eurasia, that sound slightly different than our red crossbills.
That's cool. Joan, you took your, I think Joan, you took your mute off. Did you want to ask a question? Nope, she put her mute back on. Okay, Richard.
The taxonomy and classification of.
How we go.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, Richard, could you just hold on for 1 sec? We'll let Joan ask. Thanks. Go ahead, Joan.
I do want to comment back. All my life I've had a mantra and it goes, no habitat, no birds. And I keep saying that over and over, but I do want to make a quick thank you first to Tyler, but a reply to, I believe it was Gary and Jane or Jean.
Yes.
And that's the Acadian forest. And it's not generally known that it's a unique habitat in the entire world. It's only found in mainland Nova Scotia, the southern part of Cape Breton, a little bit of New Brunswick, a little bit of northern Maine and New Hampshire. And it is unique, and it is a mixed transition zone between Carolinian and boreal. And so much of the research, Tyler, is done on the boreal and boreal birds. But I believe, I don't know, but I believe that the Acadian forest and the transition zone is a very special habitat that's very good for finches, especially during their migrations. Would you want to reply to that or add to it or negate it?
Southern boreal species like evening grosbeaks, pine siskins, purple finches would are probably breeding in that habitat fairly widespread. For the birds in the boreal, when they leave and come south, it depends if there's the food here or not.
Mhm.
Whatever, like right now, the Acadian forest, the Great Lakes St. Lawrence forest, and the Carolinian forest all have a poor food source, most of it. So that's why they think a lot of these birds went all the way down to Florida,
Mhm.
because they're running scared trying to find food. They think some of these species this might be a culling flight for some of these species if they don't find food. That's why I was saying about keep your feeders up in April and May, because these birds are going to come up, and they left in big numbers fast for a reason, and they're coming back up to breed. They're still looking for that food, so they're gonna need a good food source on the way back up. So yeah, keep those feeders up,
Okay.
because you'll see they will find them and they will use them. But yeah, if the Acadian forest and Great Lakes St. Lawrence forest has a food source, a cone crop going for them, or a seed crop, especially birch, it will stop these birds dead in their tracks.
Yeah.
Like if there's a white birch crop, which next year, from looking at all the birches this year, next year should be a pretty good crop for birch trees. Yeah,
Mhm.
that will stop the redpolls dead in their tracks on the way down.
Great.
They'll just hit that and go, okay, we don't need to go any further south. And the
Mhm.
pine siskins will sit around too and enjoy it.
Great. Then we'd better stop killing all the broadleaf trees in the Acadian forest in favor of only red spruce.
Yeah.
Just saying.
Mm-hmm. Richard,
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Joan. Richard, did you want to ask a question?
Well, just it's a redpoll question. If you look at the British or European field guides and compare them with the North American field guides and the blurb online on taxonomy, they're all quite different. The Brits claim that there are different species of redpolls and maybe they should all be lumped, and Hoaries are the same species as mealy redpolls, and they may be different from Horniman's redpolls. We over here, we regard them as being two species of redpolls, hoary and common. What are your views on that?
I have not done any DNA work on them, but I think they're a relatively young species compared to other tropical species since they evolved after the glaciers. But yeah, there's the two subspecies of common redpolls. There's actually three subspecies of common redpolls and the two species of hoary redpolls. There's a debate what you want to call a species. Are they genetically different enough? Or then there's also the debate that hoary redpolls are actually common redpolls that are they're all one big redpoll family. And then in Eurasia, you have the lesser redpolls too, which throws everything in the mix. I'm not a geneticist, and I honestly have not had enough wine to sit there and read all the journals for a long enough time to understand their protein analysis.
Thank you.
You're too busy looking at trees.
Yes. Yeah, one thing when I took this over, I didn't realize I'd be looking at weather from months beforehand. I look at the boreal forest every day in the morning. I look from one coast to the other coast. I have several weather stations. I just check the weather and what's going on. I didn't know I'd be looking at insect outbreaks and various insect crops I didn't even know about. There's insects I'm looking at in forestry reports. I call them tree pests, just trying to figure out who feeds on them, are they outbreaking, where they're going.
Yeah, it's much more complicated than we thought.
Yes.
John Kearney asks, are there any scientific publications showing that finches depend on bird feeders, or does the threat of picking up a disease outweigh the benefit?
I think the disease is a factor, but I don't think it's widespread on most years, because a lot of years some birds will use the feeder, some will stay out in the woods. But this year, feeders are actually seem to be quite important right across North America, because the food source in most of North America is very poor. There's eruptions of finches out of the mountains in the Rockies. There's species in Oklahoma. They've had in Kansas have had species of finches that breed in the Rockies that show up in Kansas like once every 30 years, because it seems basically the vast majority, other than the central to western boreal forest, the food source is very poor this year. So feeders are an important source. And as if you clean them, if you see a sick bird, shut down your feeders for a while to try to disperse them. But as I said earlier, with my red poles on, I just scatter seed in the ground and say, there you go. But yeah, it's an important year this year. Like the study in Pennsylvania with they're doing the grosbeaks. They're finding out you think you have the same flock of grosbeaks come to your feeder. No, they tag them and all that. And they think the same flock comes back 2 hours later. No, they're all different grosbeaks and none of them are banded.
Oh,
They're all doing their own little cycles around. So if you
wow.
think you have one flock of grosbeaks at your house, unless you can band them, there are probably multiple flocks doing circuits around.
Neat. Yeah.
Like
Well,
on my
still
house, I have on a good day 70 red poles and 100 siskins. Today I had 20 siskins and no red poles. They're just doing their own cycle. Tomorrow it may be up again.
That's a nice flock to have in your yard.
Yeah, they like their stuff, but some days they come, some days they don't. But yeah, this year, as I said, one last thing as I'm rambling. Yeah, this year the feeders are pretty important, it seems.
Okay, that's helpful because we are, like I said at the beginning of this meeting, we are seeing a few reports of diseased birds or sick birds. So it's helpful. We're trying to balance, typically in the summer when there's lots of food around and we have an outbreak of trick, we'll ask people to take their feeders down. And not everybody does, but a lot of people do comply. But now we're not used to having trick in the winter. So it's new for us.
Yeah, I think it's just the high density of birds coming in for concentrated food sources is giving the disease some chance.
Yeah. Okay.
But yeah, I've had to take my feeders down for a week before in the dead of winter when I notice one sick bird. I'm like, okay, I just need to get you guys away from here for a bit and clean stuff and then wait.
Yeah. That's good help. Thank you. I think that's all the questions we have. Thank you so much, Tyler. This was excellent. I really enjoyed the presentation. And I'm seeing the comments that a lot of people feel the same way.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
It was a pleasure.
And enjoy the last 2 weeks of common red poles and the spring migration of everyone else coming back north.
Yeah, that's what I'm looking forward to. Seeing more birds. Folks, you're welcome to stay online for a little while if anyone has any other comments that they'd like to make. Who's going birding to find red poles tomorrow? Angela, where would you look?
You wouldn't look where I live, that's for sure. You've
Well-
had virtually none, and I noticed that shows up in the maps quite nicely, that it's just virtually nothing along the southwestern shore from here to Yarmouth County, which means from southwest from Halifax.
It has seemed quiet for them, but maybe if I do another tour of the waterfront, maybe I can find some weedy spots.
You have a snow cover still, or is your snow gone?
It's almost gone.
Go look at the fields, look at the pastures and weedy fields. Because here, once the snow comes in, they come near the feeders, and when the snow melts, they just disappear right back out into the fields again.
Good to know.
What does you call it, the weed that they love? You said lambs.
Lamb's quarters is one of the weeds that they like to. That goldenrod aster.
Okay.
The taller weedy fields, they just like to disappear into them.
Yeah, you described how they sort of appear and then disappear, and that's my experience. Just really resonated with me because it seems like every once in a while you'll see a flock fly off, but they do seem to just disappear into nowhere.
Yeah, once they figure out there's a good food source there, they'll be utilizing. As I said, if you see a great field and no one's there, drive by it a few more times. Because eventually the lottery will tell you they will pop up. because they will come to the roadside for grit right near these fields. So yeah, if you have a dirt road near a nice weedy field, it looks quite good for them.
It's not supposed to be very nice tomorrow, actually. It's supposed to be very cold and windy in Nova Scotia. I've been trying to find a great place to bird. Any suggestions, folks?
Find the berries.
Yeah, there's not very many berries around. We had like waves of pine siskins and then white-winged crossbills and red crossbills go through where I live, which is just outside Halifax. And you could just see the berries go down and down and down. And now there's very few left for the poor little redwings that are hanging around the province.
And we had starlings here cleaning up the buckthorn and every berry creep they could find. And then the robins came out of the boreal forest with no berries there, and they just bulldozed right through our berry crop. And then what was left is European buckthorn, and the Bohemian waxwing showed up. We had one spot one day. We had a flock of 1,600 Bohemian waxwings for about 40 minutes, and then they all split up and went their own separate way. And we have not seen them since. But they're just cleaning up everything they can find on the way through. And if you want to send us a red wing, we need a red wing for the province of Ontario. We've never had a red wing. We'll happily take one.
We'll package one up.
Yeah, we'll give you a prothonotary warbler, or if you want a Kirkland warbler, we'll send you one of them.
We want a Kirkland.
Yeah.
We get prothonotary. Kirkland would be nice. We do. I think there's probably been Kirkland seen in the province, isn't there?
They're now breeding in Ontario now.
Oh, wow.
But they're breeding in military bases. One near Ottawa and one north of Toronto. There's colonies of Kirkland's warblers that found actually it's in the tank ranges where the forest, the fields keep burning there from the tank fires. It's all simulated beautiful young jack pine forest there, and the Kirkland's warblers have moved in there.
Wow.
So they're now trying to simulate the similar habitat outside of the bases too, to try to bring more out. But yeah, the Kirklands are increasing. You may see them sooner than later. Young jack pine, open jack pine fields.
Graham's just looking for a red pole. He doesn't want a red wing. He just wants a red pole. There's only one Florida record. Graham Williams is here at the Zoom call here with. He's calling in from Florida. Does a lot of birding in Nova Scotia.
They're not that far north of Florida, but there's the one evening grosbeak that's come to a feeder just north of Orlando, apparently. And there's another 2 evening grosbeaks up in Tallahassee.
We're getting there.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, if you want to see something interesting, go look at these feeder cameras from the southern U.S., from North Carolina, all the way to the Audubon one in West Texas. And you look at it, and you're seeing all these southern species, but then you're seeing half the birds are pine siskins.
Yeah.
Pine siskins, purple finches, right beside tufted titmice and Carolina chickadees.
It's pretty cool.
Well, thank you for having me. If anyone has any last questions, I have to go feed my daughter's dinner.
Thanks, Tyler. Really appreciate it.
Thanks,
Well,
Tyler.
thank you very much for having me. I greatly appreciate it. Bye.